She was standing on the side of a dark highway with no phone, no money, and her sick baby in her arms. The car that had just thrown them out was already gone. The taillights had disappeared around a bend in the road, maybe 2 minutes ago. Maybe 3. She wasn't sure. What she was sure of was the cold and the silence and the sound of Mason's breathing against her neck. Earlier that night, her mother-in-law had looked her in the face and said it plainly, "You're broken and you gave him a broken child." This is the story of what Cassie Harmon did next. The night Mason finally got his block tower to stand, Cassie laughed out loud. She was sitting on the nursery floor with her back against the crib, watching him concentrate, 14-month-old, nose scrunched, both hands hovering over 3 plastic blocks like he was diffusing something important. When the tower held, he shrieked and clapped, and she pulled him into her lap and kissed the top of his head, and for about 30 seconds the whole world was exactly that small and exactly that good. Then he coughed. The same cough. Dry, catching somewhere deep in his chest, the kind that made her go still every time she heard it. It had been going on for 2 weeks. Dr. Furlow at the county clinic had looked Mason over for about 4 minutes and told Cassie it was probably the molars coming in, that his immune system was a little run down, that it would pass. Cassie had nodded and driven home and spent the next 2 weeks telling herself Dr. Furlow was right. She was getting better at not believing herself. Kyle was home, she could tell by the television in the living room, some sports recap going at low volume, but he hadn't come into the nursery. He rarely did anymore. When Cassie carried Mason to the kitchen to give him his evening syrup, Kyle appeared in the doorway with his arms crossed and said the cough sounded worse. She agreed and mentioned carefully that she'd been thinking about taking Mason to a private pediatric practice, someone with more time to do a thorough workup. Kyle said they weren't made of money. He said the clinic doctor already looked at him. He said Cassie had a habit of turning small things into expensive problems, and then he went back to the couch. That was the whole conversation. Kyle's mother Diane had called him 3 times already that day. Cassie had heard his side of each one from the next room. Diane called 5 times most days. She had a key to the house and used it without notice, coming by 3 times a week to reorganize Cassie's kitchen cabinets, cook Kyle's favorite meals, and mentioned that Cassie's cooking was a little lean for a man who worked as hard as her son did. Kyle's paycheck went to his truck payment, his personal expenses, and a regular transfer to Diane's account that Cassie had stopped asking about. The mortgage, most of the utilities, and nearly everything Mason needed came out of what Cassie earned managing social media accounts for small businesses from the second bedroom. It covered about 70% of what kept the house. She stood at the kitchen window after Kyle went back to the living room. Down the block, a couple was at the neighborhood playground, taking turns lifting a toddler into the air, the kid going boneless with laughter each time. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from a client. The content revisions were 2 days late, another missed deadline, and there would be a penalty clause invoked. She set the phone face down and watched the couple at the playground a little longer. "I want you to remember that window. Because that's the last quiet moment she gets for a long time." That night, after she put Mason down and listened to his breathing even out, she made a decision she didn't tell anyone. She was going to take him to a real specialist. She was going to pay for it herself. And she was not going to ask Kyle's permission. Mason's temperature was 99.4. Again. Cassie had the thermometer in her hand and was writing the number in the Notes app on her phone. She'd been logging it every morning for a week when her phone rang. Diane. 6:53 in the morning. Cassie answered because not answering always made things worse. The first 2 minutes were warm. Diane asked after Mason, in the sweet voice she used when she wanted something, called him her little pumpkin, asked if he'd slept okay. Then she asked why Cassie had booked an appointment at a private pediatric practice. Cassie didn't ask how Diane knew. She already understood that Kyle told his mother things before he told her. She said she wanted Mason seen by someone with more time to do a thorough exam. Diane's voice shifted. She said the money Cassie brought into this marriage was family money, which meant it was Kyle's money. And spending it on appointments they didn't need without Kyle's say so was not how a household worked. Then she hung up. Kyle came into the kitchen about 20 minutes later, already having talked to his mother again. Cassie could tell by the set of his jaw before he said a word. He told her if that doctor found nothing wrong, she was paying back every dollar out of her own personal account. She said okay, and put Mason's jacket on. Dr. Samuel Park's office was on the north side of Knoxville, and the waiting room was clean and unhurried in a way the county clinic never was. When Dr. Park came in, he didn't rush. He sat across from Cassie and listened to the whole history without interrupting. 2 weeks of coughing, the low-grade fever, the way Mason had gotten quieter and less interested in food. He didn't tell her it was probably teething. When he examined Mason, he took his time, and at the end he sat back and said the cough concerned him. He said there was something in the lower lung field he didn't like. He wanted a chest x-ray and a full blood panel, including a genetic marker screen. Cassie asked what he was looking for. He said he wanted the results before he answered that, and that she was right to come in. The bill at checkout was just under $800, roughly half of the personal savings she'd kept in her own account since before the marriage. Money set aside quietly, the way you set aside a flashlight you hope you never need. She paid without hesitating, and carried Mason out to the parking lot. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, then opened the rideshare app. Her hands were not steady enough to drive. Mason fell asleep against her shoulder on the way home, his breathing shallow and fast in the way that had been keeping her up at night. Dr. Park's office said results would take 3 days. When the rideshare pulled up to the house, Kyle's truck was in the driveway. Next to it, Diane's sedan. They were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee when she walked in, Mason drowsy on her hip. Neither of them said hello. They were waiting to find out what she'd done with the money. Those 3 days had a quality Cassie would remember for a long time. Not dramatic. Just long. Kyle left before 7 each morning and came home after 9, and both weekend days he spent at Diane's. He did not once ask when the results were coming. He did not ask how Mason was sleeping. Diane called every afternoon not to check on Mason but to make the same point in slightly different words each time, that private clinics had a financial incentive to find problems, that Dr. Park had probably ordered all those tests because that was how those places made their money. Cassie listened, said very little, and hung up. She picked up a second client that week, a small landscaping company that needed their accounts managed through the winter. The work wasn't much, but it gave her something to do at midnight when Mason was finally asleep and her mind wouldn't stop. She read medical forums with the laptop screen dimmed. She wasn't looking for anything specific. Then she was. The symptom profile for cystic fibrosis came up in a parent forum thread: persistent cough, low-grade fever, poor weight gain, a particular quality to the breathing. She read the thread twice, then the linked article, then closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. She told herself she wasn't a doctor. She told herself she was catastrophizing. She mostly didn't believe either thing. Monday came. Mason was in his high chair working through a bowl of pureed sweet potato when Cassie's phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Park's office. Subject line: results available, please call us at your earliest convenience. One additional line in the body: this is time sensitive. She set the phone on the counter and finished feeding Mason first because her hands needed something to do. Dr. Park picked up on the first ring. He said the results showed cystic fibrosis, mixed presentation. He said it clearly without softening it and gave her a moment before he kept going. He explained the treatment protocol: daily airway clearance sessions, pancreatic enzyme supplements, with every meal, without exception, a high-calorie specialized diet, and CFTR modulator therapy, a class of medication that had changed outcomes significantly in recent years, but came with a monthly cost without full pharmaceutical assistance, that ran several times what Cassie brought in each month. He told her to start the applications for SSI and Tennessee's Medicaid waiver for children with disabilities immediately, but warned her those processes took months and she should not wait for them. Start treatment now, he said. He would send a full care plan within the hour. She thanked him and sat at the kitchen table until she heard Mason fussing in his high chair, then got up, wiped his face, lifted him out, and held him for a long time without saying anything. That evening, she printed the paperwork and laid it on the table. Kyle came home around 8:30, picked up the papers and read. She watched his face carefully. She was looking for grief or fear or the particular expression of a person absorbing something real. What came instead was a tightening around his jaw. He set the papers down and said the words like he'd been working toward them: this came from your side of the family. His family was healthy. This was on her. He just told the woman who paid most of their mortgage, who drove his son to the doctor alone, who sat up reading medical studies at midnight, he told her it was her fault. I need you to sit with that for a second. Cassie didn't move from her chair. She was still sitting there when she heard a key in the front door. Diane still had her coat on when she picked up the paperwork from the table. She'd let herself in the way she always did and walked into the middle of something without breaking stride. She found her reading glasses and stood under the kitchen light and read. Cassie watched her face. It didn't show confusion or worry or the softness a grandmother's face is supposed to show when something is wrong with her grandchild. It showed something closer to confirmation. When she set the papers down, she looked at Cassie and said it plainly, "You're broken and you gave him a broken child." She turned to Kyle and told him not to give a single dollar toward any of this. Kyle had been quiet since he'd read the diagnosis. There had been one moment where something shifted in his face, something that might have opened into a different kind of conversation. That moment closed. He nodded at his mother and said she was right. Cassie told them both to leave. She said it once quietly. Diane picked up her purse and on her way out said without turning around, "Don't come crying to us when the money runs out." The front door closed. The house went quiet in the way it goes quiet after people who take up a lot of space have finally left it. Cassie checked on Mason first. He was asleep on his back, one arm thrown out to the side. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then went to the kitchen and called her mother. Linda picked up on the second ring. It was almost 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in Greenville, and she answered like she'd been waiting. Cassie started to explain, and about 30 seconds in her voice broke and she stopped. Linda didn't fill the silence. She just waited. When Cassie finished, Linda said, "I'm calling the school in the morning and taking personal leave. I'll be there by Thursday." Cassie said she didn't need to do that. Linda said she wasn't asking. After she hung up, Cassie opened her laptop and made 3 lists in a document she labeled simply Mason. Medications and costs. SSI and Medicaid waiver application steps in order. Income, current clients, realistic capacity, leads she'd been sitting on. She worked through all 3 until nearly 4 in the morning. Kyle did not come home. Somewhere during the second list, she realized she hadn't thought about where he was in over an hour. By the time she closed the laptop, she understood she didn't need to. Linda arrived Thursday afternoon with 2 suitcases and a casserole dish wrapped in foil, and by Friday morning she had Mason's entire care schedule memorized. She learned the airway clearance technique from Dr. Park's instructional video and practiced the rhythm until she had it right. She measured enzyme supplements before every meal, kept a daily log in a notebook from the Walgreens 2 blocks over, and ran every nebulizer session with the focused calm of someone who had decided this was her job now. The hours Linda gave her, Cassie used to work and to stand in lines at government offices and to sit in waiting rooms with a folder of documents that kept getting thicker. Kyle reappeared 3 days after Linda arrived, set a bag of groceries on the counter without unpacking it, and said maybe they should talk about working things out. Linda took Mason to the nursery and closed the door. Cassie asked Kyle what specifically he was prepared to contribute toward Mason's monthly medication costs. He said he'd give something. She asked what number he had in mind. He said this was all moving very fast. She told him she was filing for divorce and seeking full medical child support. He picked up the grocery bag and left. Bill Tanner's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown. He explained the Tennessee child support formula without making it complicated: base percentage of income adjusted upward for documented chronic medical need. And in a case like Mason's, the court could order supplemental support significantly above the standard amount. He asked who could testify to Cassie's role as Mason's primary caregiver. She listed everything: every appointment at Dr. Park's office scheduled and attended by her, every pharmacy receipt in her name, every insurance filing, every prior authorization request. Kyle's name appeared on none of it. Bill Tanner wrote that down and said they had a strong foundation. 2 weeks later, Kyle filed a counter-custody motion claiming Cassie was financially unstable, alleging misuse of household funds and requesting primary placement of Mason. Cassie read the filing at Bill Tanner's office and kept her face still. Bill Tanner said this was a pressure tactic and that the paper record would answer it. Then Diane called Linda directly. Cassie wasn't in the room, but she heard her mother's voice go flat in the way it did when Linda was holding something carefully in check. Afterward, Linda told her Diane had mentioned conversationally that she had a contact in the Greene County school system and that teaching positions weren't always as secure as people assumed. Cassie called Kyle that same evening and told him if Diane contacted her mother again about her job or anything else, she would file a police harassment report and flag it with the court. Kyle said his mother was just worried about the family. The warning email from her biggest client came on a Wednesday night: content below standard, one more miss and the contract would be terminated. Cassie was at the kitchen desk with Mason's nebulizer running in the next room, the low mechanical hum coming through the wall when she read it. She put her head down on the desk and cried without making any sound because Linda was asleep 10 feet away and Mason was asleep 20 feet beyond that. She sat like that for a few minutes. Then she sat back up. She wrote to the client before she made coffee the next morning 3 days to deliver a revised concept or she would refund the advance. No drama, his choice. He agreed within the hour. That small window bought her enough time to start moving in a different direction entirely. She spent that morning pulling every financial record from the month Mason was born forward, clinic co-pays, pharmacy receipts, formula diapers, the $800 visit to Dr. Park, medication costs covered out of pocket while insurance pre-authorization was pending. Kyle's name appeared 4 times across 14 months. Hers appeared on everything else. When she brought the spreadsheet to Bill Tanner, he looked at it for a long moment and said this was exactly what they needed. At that same meeting, she mentioned the joint savings account wedding gift money from her grandmother, just over $12,000 with interest untouched since they'd opened it. Bill Tanner told her clearly that withdrawing from a joint account during active divorce proceedings carried legal risk, that the other side could argue dissipation of marital assets. Cassie thanked him for telling her. That afternoon, she transferred the full balance to her personal checking account, labeled it litigation and medical reserve in her records, and kept a separate log documenting that every dollar would go toward Mason's treatment costs and legal fees, nothing personal, nothing untraceable. It was a risk she understood completely. She made it anyway. Through a CF parent forum, she found Dr. Patricia Okafor at Vanderbilt Monroe Carell Jr. Children's Hospital in Nashville, a pediatric pulmonologist running one of the strongest cystic fibrosis programs in the Southeast. A cancellation had opened up. Nashville was 3 hours west on I-40 and the regular wait list ran 4 to 6 months. She took the slot and texted Kyle the date and time as her attorney required. He called back within 10 minutes and said he wanted to come. Her first instinct was no. Her second, arriving about 3 seconds later, was more useful. She wanted him in that room. She wanted him to hear it from someone he couldn't dismiss. She told him to be at the house at 6 in the morning. He said he would. He was. So was Diane, standing next to his truck with a weekend bag, announcing she wasn't about to let her grandson make that drive without family. Cassie looked at Kyle. He looked at the ground. She put Mason in his car seat and got in the car. They left at 6:15, headlights still on the sky, the gray that comes before November sunrise. Diane rode in the back next to Mason's car seat, which put Linda up front, which meant the seating arrangement resolved itself without anyone saying a word about it. Kyle drove. Cassie sat behind him with one hand resting near Mason's. Diane filled the first hour with commentary. Road construction outside Cookeville, the coffee prices at the rest stop, the general inconvenience of the drive. Nobody responded in any sustained way. Linda had a paperback open. Cassie watched the tree line and said almost nothing, which was its own kind of preparation. Vanderbilt Monroe Carell Jr. Children's Hospital was newer than Cassie had expected, well lit with murals in the corridors and staff who spoke directly to Mason when they brought him into the exam room. Dr. Patricia Okafor came in without preamble. She was precise and unhurried in a way that created immediate trust. She reviewed Dr. Park's records, examined Mason, thoroughly confirmed the diagnosis without softening it, adjusted 2 medication dosages and added a newer CFTR modulator to the protocol, more targeted, more effective, and expensive without full manufacturer assistance. When Diane leaned forward and mentioned a relative who had managed a lung condition with an herbal supplement, Dr. Okafor stopped her with a look that was entirely courteous and continued without acknowledging the comment. At the end of the appointment, she looked at all 4 of them and said one more thing in the tone people use when they need something to land: psychological stability in the home was not optional. Children with cystic fibrosis were acutely sensitive to stress in their environment. Chronic tension affected respiratory function in measurable, documented ways. This was part of the treatment. She said it plainly, and then she was done. Kyle walked out of that room without saying anything. The drive back was 3 hours of silence, broken only by Mason fussing somewhere outside of Cookeville and Diane staring out the window without commentary for the first time all day. On the interstate somewhere east of Nashville, Cassie watched Kyle's face in the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at the road with the expression of a man processing something difficult. He was looking at it with the expression of a man calculating. She had been hoping in some quiet part of herself that Dr. Okafor's words might reach somewhere useful in him, the part about the child feeling the tension, the part about the home. Watching his face in that mirror, she understood they hadn't. What he was thinking about was the cost of the new medication. She could tell by the set of his jaw. It was the same jaw she'd seen in the kitchen the night she mentioned a private pediatrician. By the time they crossed back into Knox County, she already knew what was coming. She just didn't know the shape of it yet. That night in the kitchen, Kyle said he didn't want this life. He said it with his jacket still on, like he'd walked in already planning to leave. He didn't want every paycheck going to a pharmacy. He didn't want a child who would need this level of care indefinitely. He took his keys off the counter and walked out. Cassie stood at the kitchen doorway and watched his headlights back out of the driveway, and what she felt was not what she expected. It was closer to relief, the release of a pressure that had been building so long that its absence felt almost like rest. 4 days later, Bill Tanner called with information from a contact at the county clerk's office. Diane's condo was listed and under contract. Kyle had been seen moving boxes. The pattern suggested they were preparing to leave Knoxville, possibly relocating further south. Once they established residency elsewhere, collecting child support would become significantly harder to enforce. Cassie thanked him and called Kyle. She said she knew about the condo and wasn't calling to fight. She wanted to meet before anything became a legal emergency. Kyle said to come to the strip mall off Route 11W, the one with the old hardware store on the corner, at 7 that evening. Bring Mason, he said. He wanted to see his son. She came by rideshare, with Mason, in his carrier and his diaper bag over one shoulder. Running through the conversation, she'd planned the specific numbers, the child support worksheet, the offer she was prepared to make. Kyle was already in the lot. So was Diane, standing slightly behind him with her arms crossed. Cassie noticed the weekend bag visible through the rear window of Kyle's Tahoe. She didn't say anything about it. Kyle suggested they get in the car to talk, more private than a parking lot. Cassie got in the back with Mason. The car pulled out of the strip mall and turned onto Route 11W, heading east away from the city. Cassie asked where they were going. Kyle said just driving, easier to talk. The businesses thinned out. The road went dark on both sides, tree line, no houses, no lights from driveways. Kyle said he and his mother had been thinking. He said they'd decided the best thing for Mason was a fresh start somewhere with real resources and financial stability. He said they were going to take him. When Cassie said no, when she pulled Mason tighter and told him to stop the car, Kyle pulled onto the shoulder and put it in park. He got out, came around to her door and opened it. Cassie stepped out, holding Mason against her chest, one arm wrapped around him, refusing to let go. Kyle grabbed her by the arm and shoved her backward onto the gravel shoulder. She kept her grip on Mason and stumbled but didn't fall. Then Diane was out of the car and reaching for Mason from the other side, and in the struggle, Cassie's phone slid out of her jacket pocket and skittered across the asphalt into the dark. Kyle got back behind the wheel. Diane got in. The door closed. Diane's window came down 4 inches. "We're not paying a dime for those meds," she said. The Tahoe pulled back onto Route 11W and the taillights shrank, and then they were gone. Cassie stood on the gravel shoulder with Mason in her arms. He had started crying during the struggle and hadn't stopped. She pressed her cheek against the top of his head and held him and let him cry, because there was nothing else she could do right then. No phone on the ground anywhere she could see. No money. No way to reach anyone. Just the dark road and the cold and her son's weight against her chest. She started walking. She had been walking for about 20 minutes. Mason quieter now, but still awake, his head heavy on her shoulder, when she heard something large slow down behind her, air brake sighing, gravel shifting under wide tires. Earl Briggs had pulled out of a truck stop on the far side of Knoxville roughly 20 minutes earlier. His dashcam had been running continuously, the way it always did. It had recorded the strip mall parking lot when he'd stopped to use the restroom before getting back on the road, the lot, the Tahoe, the struggle at the car door, the Tahoe pulling away. A woman and a baby left standing on the shoulder. It had most of the plate. He didn't know the full weight of any of that yet when he opened his cab door and looked down at a woman standing alone on a dark highway at 8 o'clock on a November night, holding a baby and walking toward the city with nowhere else to go. The deputy at the Knox County Sheriff's substation listened to Cassie's account with the patience of someone who has heard a lot of domestic situations and learned not to move too fast. He said it sounded like a family disagreement that got out of hand. He said these things usually found their way to resolution. Earl put his phone on the desk and said he had something they should look at first. The dashcam footage ran about 2 minutes: the strip mall lot, the Tahoe, Cassie getting in with Mason, the car leaving. Then the rural stretch of Route 11W, the shoulder, the door opening, a woman holding a baby being shoved out onto the gravel, the car pulling away and leaving them both standing in the dark. The partial plate from the lot footage was clear enough to run. The deputy watched it twice without speaking, then picked up his radio. The tone in the room changed in the way it changes when something stops being a family disagreement and becomes something with documentation and a child involved. They filed a report for child endangerment and reckless abandonment, issued a "Be on the lookout" for the Tahoe, and contacted the child welfare unit on call. A nurse examined Mason at the substation. He was cold and overtired but unharmed. Earl drove Cassie home when they were done, 40 minutes out of his route. Linda opened the front door before Cassie reached the porch steps. She'd been awake, calling Cassie's phone every 15 minutes since 7. She saw Mason first, then Cassie's face, and pulled them both inside without asking anything. Earl left his number on the counter and told Cassie he was going to post the dashcam footage to his Facebook page, Miles and People, when he got back on the road. He asked if that was all right. Cassie said, "Don't blur my face. Let them see it." The post went up at 2:17 in the morning. 3 sentences from Earl about what he'd found on the highway, a request that anyone recognizing the vehicle contact Knox County Sheriff's Office, and a link to a GoFundMe Cassie had set up 6 weeks earlier for Mason's medication costs. That fund had raised $340 in 6 weeks. By 6 in the morning, the post had spread through a dozen local Knoxville groups. By 9, 2 news stations were running the dashcam footage on their morning broadcasts. By that evening, the GoFundMe had passed $80,000, with donations coming in from across Tennessee and from people in other states who had seen the video shared into their feeds. Over the following days, as the story continued to spread, the total climbed past 200,000 and kept going. Kyle's dealership manager called him that first morning before Kyle had any idea the video existed. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. At will, employment required no further process. Knox County deputies found Kyle and Diane at the South Knoxville rental unit mid-morning. They were taken in for questioning. The dashcam footage was unambiguous: a woman holding an infant shoved out of a moving vehicle onto a rural highway at night. There was no version of that which resolved itself quietly. By the time their attorneys finished explaining the exposure, Kyle had stopped talking about custody entirely. November came back around the way it always does, quiet and gray, and Mason walked straight through it. Not the watchful stillness of the child Cassie had spent the previous year monitoring breath by breath. He moved through the living room with the confidence of a 2-year-old who has somewhere to be, pushing a toy truck along the baseboard with complete dedication. Narrating something to himself in the half-language that Linda had started writing down in a notebook because she didn't want to forget any of it. The CFTR modulator therapy was working. His weight was up, his lung function stable, his color good. He still had cystic fibrosis. That was not a thing that changed, but he was managed carefully and consistently every single day. And the difference between this child and the child he had been a year ago was visible to anyone who had known him then. Cassie had left freelance social media behind in the spring. The GoFundMe had closed just under $300,000, and she had moved that money into a dedicated account for Mason's long-term medical costs. It gave her something she hadn't had in a long time: a little room to make a different choice. She used it to complete a pediatric respiratory therapy aid certification at a community college on the north side of Knoxville, and now worked part-time at the Tennessee chapter of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Sitting across from parents who were exactly where she had been the year before, holding a diagnosis. They didn't understand paperwork, they didn't know how to file. Trying to figure out how to keep their child alive on an income that wasn't built for it. She knew every form. She knew every wait time. She knew which phone numbers actually got answered. Linda never went back to Green Neville. She retired in the spring, packed what she needed, and made the move permanent without making a production of it. She was there for every nebulizer session, every enzyme count, every appointment. Earl came through Knoxville twice on his routes, once in March, once in October. He brought Mason a toy dump truck the first time and a toy semi the second, both large enough to be taken seriously. Mason called him Uncle Earl and presented the trucks with the gravity of someone sharing important news. Kyle came once. It was Mason's 2nd birthday, a Saturday afternoon. He knocked rather than using a key he no longer had. He was thinner, wearing a jacket that had seen better seasons, and he was holding something wrapped in brown paper. He had been taking woodworking classes at a community center a couple of evenings a week. Inside the brown paper was a small wooden horse he had made himself, sanded smooth, a mane suggested in careful cuts along the neck. Not a perfect object. Clearly made by someone still learning. Mason examined it with great seriousness and went back to his trucks. Kyle watched him for a while without saying much and stayed 20 minutes. At the door, he said he regretted it every day. Cassie said, "I know. Good night, Kyle." He nodded and left. Linda asked afterward, without making it larger than it was, whether Cassie had forgiven him. Cassie thought about it honestly. She said she didn't know. Not hatred, she said. More like space, the kind left when something that used to take up a lot of room is finally gone. Linda nodded and went back to what she was doing. Cassie put the wooden horse on the shelf in the nursery, next to a photograph of Mason from the previous spring, the one where he was laughing at something off camera with his whole face. The horse sat there slightly imperfect, made by someone trying to do one small thing right. The wooden horse sat on that shelf, and every morning when Cassie walked past it she didn't feel much. Just that space where something used to be and a life she had built out of the pieces left over. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing on that road that night, no phone, no money, holding your sick baby in the cold with no way to call anyone, what would you have done? Not what you think you should have done. What do you actually believe you would have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.